you so much for joining the Introscope Spotlight on Internal Communication series that I run on my blog and on my YouTube channel. I've been talking to thought leaders about various aspects of internal communications, from communication planning to execution to executive presence to digital marketing. So very delighted to have you on my show to talk about internal digital channels and gig mindset. And I know you're doing a lot of work in that space. So before we get started, Jane, if you could quickly introduce yourself for our viewers.
Sure, and thank you very much for inviting me to your sessions.
Thank you.
I am, well, my name's Jane McConnell, as you know, and I have been, living in France now for nearly 40 years. I was born in America, and that's a long time. In fact, I've lived more in France than in the United States, where I was born. And it's amusing because my son, who was born in France, left for the United States. He's now been in the United States more than in France. So we're sort of a family that goes back and forth. I have been specialized in digital strategies inside organizations, and I've worked with for about over 20 years now with huge global organizations on their digital strategies, which has been absolutely fascinating because I've seen the whole move from not being very digital to becoming very digital. That's been really interesting. And how many years ago? Back in 2006, I started a survey, a global survey, looking at trends in, at that time, I called it intranets. And after a few years, it became digital workplace. And I did that for 10 consecutive years. And I could see things happening gradually, changes. The survey data was great because it was from 300, 400 organizations around the world. It wasn't European-centric, it wasn't North America-centric, it was pretty global. And I could see what I call the emergence of the individual. The voice of the individual was coming out. And at the same time, I could see that the attitude of senior management was pretty, I don't want to say resistant, but pretty much at a low level in terms of openness. And so there was a collision about to happen. And that got me onto the idea of a gig mindset. Excuse me. By gig mindset, I'm thinking not of gig workers in the gig economy, but freelance mental attitudes that employees have inside organizations. And I ran a survey about that. I think you participated in the first one.
Yes, I did. Yes.
Yeah, I remember you from that in 2018.
Yes.
And drew certain conclusions, published a report about that. And then I just ran what I call phase 2 in 2021 because I wanted to see what it was like after, I won't say after the pandemic because that's going on still in a lot of places, but let's say post 2020 where there have been a lot of changes. And so that's basic. Oh yeah, of course. And then I published a book. Which I'm very pleased about, the Gig Mindset Advantage, which came out about a month ago.
Great, brilliant.
And so I'm very pleased with that. It has case studies in it and a lot of conclusions and observations I've gotten from all people around the world.
Great. So that's a brilliant background, and I'm extremely credible journey of building all these reports and trends. So if I were to ask you, you've been researching internal digital channels. What are some of the trends you see, and especially now that we are in the midst of this pandemic?
Well, what's really interesting is that a major trend is people realize, I'm talking about inside companies, need to become or have become by need dependent on digital. In that there's no other way to communicate, no other way to get your work done. And that's made a huge difference for a lot of companies. I know one company very well who was just launching a major revamp of their digital workplace, and the lockdown occurred. This is a French company, well, headquartered in France, but a global company. And they managed to get it rolled out during the first months of the pandemic here in France, which happened beginning in 2020, around March, I think was our first lockdown. And they managed to get it rolled out. And they say to me now that they think it went faster and easier, I hate to say it, but thanks to the pandemic, because It was no longer a choice of, do I use this new tool? Do I not use it? It's, I use this if I'm going to work. And something that I think is happening right now, I don't want to get into with you because it's not really our topic, but the big debate right now is going back to work. I'm thinking now of countries where the vaccination rates are high, people are beginning to take off masks with controversial, of course, and it's so different. In North America, Europe, and India, and South Asia, it's very, very different. So it's hard to draw conclusions. There are no conclusions. But what's interesting is this whole debate about a lot of people don't want to go back to the office. Other people don't want to go back to the office. So this whole work from home, work back at the office, this whole debate, everyone's talking about it. All the big consultancies are writing about it. And so I don't really plan to contribute any insights to that debate. It's very nuanced. It's very, very depends on who, depends on where. And I think a lot of stuff's being said about it. So I think that's a trend. And so we'll see how that goes.
Fantastic. And you mentioned you wrote this book on gig workers and their mindset. So in the context of communication, especially internal communications, how different should communication be at aimed at this audience?
Well, it's interesting, Nancy, when you, I hate to use the word gig worker as you did, because when you say gig worker, people tend to think gig economy, And actually, the word that's important for me is mindset, the gig mindset, which is a sort of a gig worker, but employed, salaried. So quite different from someone in the fragile gig economy that's with not very much financial security. These people are salaried employees. And I think that the communication needs have changed, not so much because of these people, but in general, because of what I call the gig mindset work culture, which is beginning in companies, even if people don't identify as gig mindsetters. And the main thing is, I think that we don't want to talk about aiming communication and audiences. We need to talk about how communicators need to engage with people and to enable people to do more than what they're doing now. And I have a couple examples of two of my favorite stories from the past. Are a speaker at an internet conference I went to maybe 10, 12 years ago told us that he had a lot of people in the company who were complaining about spam in their internal email. And he said, okay, send me the spam so I can see the sources, and then we can adjust filters so you're not disturbed by this spam. Can you guess what I'm going to say next?
It's from the leaders itself.
From the corporate communication, exactly. It was corporate communication emails that they were flagging as spam. And it happened in another completely different organization I know, where it was an IT person who told me that the majority of emails that were deleted without being read came from friends in corporate communication. So these are stories from the past, but it's a indication that corporate communication had a role that was not necessarily being handled in the most appropriate way for people.
Got it. Brilliant. And so what's your advice for communicators and leaders? How can they get better at navigating the gig mindset, as you mentioned, and because of the evolving expectations of the workplace? So what can leaders and communicators do better?
One thing they can do that's really important from a digital viewpoint is they need to give space in the digital landscape inside the organization for people to communicate. And one of the questions I asked in my surveys way back, year after year after year, nothing to do with the gig mindset, just the digital environment in general. And one of my questions was about trust. I said, who do you trust? How do you rate, what level of trust do you have with your colleagues, your local management, and your global management? And again, you can probably guess what I'm going to say, and that the colleagues, they trusted their colleagues more than local management. They trusted local management more than global management. And so you can see already that you tend to trust the person who a voice of someone who is like you. And BT, the UK telecommunications company, gave a presentation again. They were really in advance. This was maybe 10, 12 years ago, where they did an experiment on their news page. They gave part of it to the corporate communicators, and then they let people from the company publish what they wanted to. And it was hilarious, Sue, because the part generated by people took all the space on the page. There was no more space for the official communicators, and so BT had to have 2 pages, one for the communicators and one for the people. And that was a really adventurous thing for them to do. I had never heard of anyone else. A lot of people don't even do that today, let alone 10, 12 years ago. So I found that really interesting. And I think what corporate communication people need to do now, or communication people in general, is they have to stop trying to control the message and give voice to people, make it easier for people to communicate. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. No, I'm a big advocate of employee advocacy and ambassadorship, and I believe that you need to co-create content with your audiences, and I think that's the right approach here. And I think your research is clearly proving that that's how it works best.
Yeah, co-creation can be quite difficult for people who have been accustomed to creating all the content themselves. They create the content, they show it to management, who signs off or not on it. And the idea of co-creating it with people in the company is challenging for some of them. Yeah. There's a guy on my, I think it was, the Gig Mindset Advisory Board, who told me that IT and HR are going to disappear as corporate functions. He said they're going to disappear because they're going to be absorbed by the businesses, because what they do is essential for business. Right. And I found that very, very interesting idea. And I think communicators will see the same thing happen if they don't change the way they work. They will be absorbed into business because communication is essential, more and more essential as time goes by. Because we get down to this whole thing about what do you trust? Fake news, all these questions that people ask.
Got it. So I think you did mention some of the examples, but are there any best practices that you have observed based on some of the companies, this companies you have surveyed or engaged with?
Yeah, there was a major global bank who told me about what they did, what the communicators did. And the communicators were basically completely changing their role. They put out a whole bunch of stories every morning, a whole bunch of news items on their digital workplace intranet, whatever they called it. And you, as an employee in the bank, could tick on certain stories. They would be downloaded on your mobile phone. And so this was about a year ago, before the lockdown. So people traveling to work could read the stories that they chose, not the ones that were posted. And so I think that's a interesting thing to do. And I noted another one here in my notes. I think the main thing there is think mobile first, because that corresponds with the way a lot of people work now. Absolutely. And when you think mobile first, it's in the hand. Mobile is a very intimate, personal thing. It's not the same as a big screen and you're looking at the internet. The mobile is you. And so you need to give people more individual control, like this particular bank.
Great. And as we wrap up, Jane, I want to ask you, what tips do you have for communicators, especially when using digital platforms and obviously engaging with the gig workforce? So I'm especially interested to know, are there risks? Are there, should they be more empathetic? Should be linked to the culture? So how do you see that, and what are your recommendations and tips?
Well, I think in terms of internal communications, it's a very important thing is to become more focused on the outside world and find ways of bringing the outside world in to your organization, and not being afraid of doing that, because a big risk is that your organization, you will miss important things going on if you don't watch the external world. And it's the people in the organization, in different parts of the organization, who have their eyes on the external world, especially the customer-facing people. And so you need to find ways of bringing that external world into the organization. I worked with a very large organization that would organize every month. They would have I forget what they called it, an evening with somebody, and they would invite someone from the external world, someone else in the corporate world, but in another company, to come and talk to their people. And they would have an event that would start around 6 o'clock in the evening when the workday was finished. And that person would give a talk on whatever they were doing. And what the guy who organized told me that he noticed that all the people came, they sat down, they took their seats and all that, but the high-level managers in the company would stand in the back of the room. They didn't want to be too visible listening, but they were there because they didn't want to miss something from the outside. And I think that's a good example. Do we have time for another example?
No, please go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. We have.
Okay. One of my favorite examples is from an interview I did when I was working for the book. And I interviewed a guy in a very, very large industrial organization. They have about 200,000 employees in 4 or 5 different countries. And they noticed that a lot of people were changing the way they were working, small little groups, looking at new methods and self-management and all these different trends that are coming out and new ways of organizing. And they were all doing different things. And so he set up a social network internally so they could communicate with each other and share what they were doing with each other. Then he brought all that to the attention of management by organizing this event outside. It was like a big fair, a big party with drinks, posters, and stands. And all these different teams came in and talked about what they were doing. And a number of the things they were doing had to do with the external world, how they were making connections externally. And so this whole event began to take place one afternoon, and he deliberately chose a place that was visible from the windows of senior management who came down the stairs, out the door, and they asked what it was, what was going on, and how come HR and communication were not down there with them. And the guy's answer was, well, he didn't see what relevance it had to communication and HR. And again, it's an example of someone who is bringing out the voice of the people and trying to make a connection with management, because that's the big gap that you have to try to bridge.
Absolutely.
So those are just a couple examples.
Fantastic, Jane. I think these are brilliant insights, and I'm sure our viewers will really love what you've shared. So thank you again for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Could I add just one thing? And
go ahead.
One thing that I think is really important that I haven't said yet, and that is that communicators are used to being at sort of the center or the top of a pyramid where they share things out. And I think a general guideline today is that communicators need to think like networkers. And they have to look at how they can enable people throughout the organization to build their own networks of other people in the organization. So there's a network of people contributing information and news to the overall organization. And thinking as a networker, I think, will make the internal communication person play a very critical role in the survivability of their organization.
Great point. Great point. Yeah, I really loved the insights and perspectives you shared. Thank you again, Jane. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed talking with you.
Same.